So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz with the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Very happy today to be with you to continue reading in our virtual reading group, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. We're in the middle of the second part of the book. It is, in my opinion, and I think I'm not alone here, the most important part of the book, in not per se to understand how totalitarianism works. That's what part 3 is, but it's really, if you're looking at the causes, the origins, the elements of totalitarianism, as we've been saying, it is where we start. And just a quick recap, right? So the first chapter was about the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie. It's about two things: the rise of the bourgeoisie to political power, and thus the creation of superfluous men, and the reduction or the loss of norms with the rise of this bourgeois man and the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, this idea that power and naked power will drive everything. So it's got an economic element to it and a more normative element to it. We then have the two chapters on race and bureaucracy, where we see that race is a necessary ideology, and bureaucracy is a necessary way of governing that allows for the justification of mass crimes in imperialism. And now we enter this chapter on the pan movements. I know when I first read this book in graduate school, I admit I didn't know what the pan movements were. They're not something one, at least as someone I grew up knowing much about. And yet Arendt begins this chapter with this bold line that Nazism and Bolshevism owe more to PanGermanism and PanSlavism, respectively, than to any other ideology or political movement. And so I think one thing you have to take very seriously here is that if there's an element of totalitarianism in the book, these pan movements are about as important as it gets, and trying to understand them is absolutely essential for understanding these two totalitarian movements. That said, there's 3 parts to the chapter, understanding pan movements. The first is this idea of tribal nationalism, that these pan movements were not simply nationalist. In fact, they weren't nationalist in the sense of representing a nation state. They were imperialist insofar as they sought to unify in an indefinite future people based on a pseudo-mystical idea of whatever tribal connection they had, and that there's this pseudo-mysticism involved in all pan movements. The second part is on lawlessness. The argument here is that at the essence of all movements is lawlessness, is a contempt for law, and bureaucracy. Now, we've talked a bit about bureaucracy, and there's been some back and forth on it, and this chapter is really helpful because she makes a distinction between 2 kinds of bureaucracy. One being a sort of failed civil service, which she finds in France at the time she's writing, and we could, I think, have a productive conversation about the failed I'm sorry, I said Secret Service, the failed civil service here in the United States, which leads to inefficiency and stagnation, but is different from what she means by this other form of bureaucracy, which is the rule by decree, which leads towards this pseudo-mystical machine which does the will of the movement. And then the third part of the chapter on parties and movements is really fascinating because she says that there were the seeds for totalitarianism, and these movements were all over the world in the 1920s and 30s, that there was a worldwide rebellion against democratic government. There was a sense among intellectuals in England and the United States and elsewhere that things were in trouble. And yet every country in Europe, on the continent almost, succumbed to dictatorship or fascism or totalitarianism. whereas the Anglo-American countries, England and America, did not. And Arendt thinks that she has a reason for this. And she argues that the reason has something to do with the two-party system, something that I think a lot of people in the United States, especially a lot of liberals, are ready to give up. There's an idea that it's not democratic enough because these two parties move to the center and don't represent the fringes, so that in Europe you can have the Green Party or the Liberal Party or the Communist Party, and you can have more of a sense of an identity with your party. And Arendt says that's bad. That's bad because what it does is it makes the parties divorce, and the people who are part of the parties separated from the state and separated from the practice of governing every couple of years when the party switched power. And that the centralization, the moving towards the center of the two-party system, but more importantly, the feeling amongst people that with the parties they actually have a chance at some point to make a difference and govern, is absolutely essential. And the antipathy to the sense that the parties have lost, that the people have lost and are alienated from the state and from government, is what leads to the possibility that these movements become fascist and then totalitarian. And I think one of the interesting things to ask today is to what extent the rise of bureaucracy and the kind of stultification and stagnation of the legislative branch in government, even in the United States and Great Britain, has led to this sense of alienation from government and a disdain for Parliament and Congress. With that in mind, I'm going to open it up, but I want to make just one comment. This week, Ted Lowy died. Ted Lowy was one of the great political thinkers of the 20th century, an American politics professor for most of his life at Cornell. And his book, The End of Liberalism, is to me one of the most important books to understand the dysfunction of America and American politics today. The basic thesis in a nutshell is that the Congress, for a whole host of reasons based in corruption and the need to be reelected, has given up their constitutional responsible role of governing and passed that role to the civil service and the administrative state. And in a sense, in order to not take the hard decisions and do the hard work of governing, Congress has abdicated its constitutional role and given it to the president and the executive branch and the administrative agencies. I think Lowy is right. And if he is, this is one interesting indication that the protection that the two-party Anglo-American system had, which is that the people think they can attain power through controlling Parliament or the legislature, actually would be disappearing in Anglo-American politics, and at least in American politics. I won't speak for Britain. And if that's the case, that would be a very dangerous development. So I want to mark Ted Lowy's passing, who to me is one of the giants of our time. So with that, let me open it up to questions, if there are questions.
Sure, I'll
go ahead.
I'll weigh in. Hitler himself was not, so far as I know, was not a member of a Pan movement. I mean, right after World War I, and maybe even slightly before, he was involved in, I guess, the equivalent of intelligence for the army, spying, and trying to do what he could to form his party. And I don't think, and again, if somebody knows more German history than I do, I don't think any of his inner circle came out of the Pan movements. So I don't know that really challenges Arendt's thesis, but I'm wondering exactly where it puts the Pan movements in Central Europe in relation to Nazism? Was it simply a kind of a spirit of the times, or were there enough pan voters, activists to make a difference? Or is it just coincidental?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. One thing so let me first say I'm not a historian of Europe, and I'm happy to have people who know more add in as well. But let's look at the first footnote, Bob, on page 222, where she cites Mein Kampf. I've said this before, but it's one of the virtues of Arendt that she reads the Nazis. And she's been criticized by a number of Jewish scholars for being anti-Semitic because she cites anti-Semitic texts. But from her point of view, in order to understand them, you have to read them. And she says that in 1939, in Mein Kampf, Hitler writes that in Vienna, I had laid the foundations for a world concept in general and a way of political thinking in particular, which I had later only to complete in detail, but which never afterward forsook me. She takes this, along with a similar citation about Stalin, to suggest that since she thinks the pan movements began in Austria, where Hitler was, and began in those years between the two world wars, she takes this to be a statement of Hitler's connection with the pan-Germanist movement. Obviously, the leaders of the pan-Germanist movement, von Schoner being the main one, were earlier in the late 19th century. But she sees Hitler as someone who is emerging out of the this worldview. Whether yes, she's not saying totalitarianism is pan-Germanism. I think it's very important for us to say that. It's different, right? She's going to say that totalitarianism emerges out of it. But she's saying that if you're looking for the elements, right, this one is more important than the others. Which doesn't mean that Hitler was himself a pan-Germanist, although I think clearly he was in an important level. I mean, part of his entire thought and action is to unite Germans, Aryans, wherever they are in Europe. This is the basic pan-German idea, and Hitler's desire for Lebensraum, his imperialism, his totalitarianism, his desire to create and reunite Germans in every part of Europe is deeply pan-German. I don't know if that is if you're looking for a smoking gun saying where Hitler says I'm a pan-German, I don't know, but I think it's fairly clear that his Nazi movement was highly indebted to it. Anyone want to add something to that? Because I'm not a historian.
I mean, I could add something very briefly if necessary, but someone else can.
Ian, why don't you start?
I was just going to mention that usually the figure that's treated as the key hinge between the Nazi Party, Hitler, and pan-Germanism is Heinrich Claus, who was very close with Hitler, introduced him to most of the people who would go on to become the Nazi Party, and was also one of the primary proponents of pan-Germanism, particularly after the war, but even before World War I. So that's usually treated as the sort of key iconic historical thinker and member of the Reichstag, who was the connection between the pan-Germanists and Nazism explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question from Jenny Lynn about, what are the slogans of the pan-Germans? She gives a number throughout the text. And so on the bottom of page 228, we get again von Schonerer saying, we Pan-Germans regard anti-Semitism as the mainstay of our national ideology. And the Pan-Slav says similar things. There's a lot about the Pan-Germans again later in this section on tribal nationalism. But the main ones are their sense that she cites their claim to be a divine and chosen people, the true divine people of modern times, as she says on 233. And that this is for her actually the reason that the Pan-Germans became anti-Semitic. I think one of the fascinating arguments here is that the Pan-Germans weren't anti-Semitic because they, again, hated Jews or knew Jews. She has this somewhat, I never know what to call it with Arendt. Ironic is not the right word, but there is a kind of irony that she sort of embraces, where she says, like on page 242, that the Pan movement's fanaticism hit upon the Jews as the ideological center, which was the beginning of the end of European Jewry, constitutes one of the most logical and most bitter revenges history has ever taken. And what she means here is that the Jews, insofar as they were the chosen people, or had imagined themselves as the chosen people, became the object and the center of the Nazis' ire and the Pan-Germans' ire, because the Pan-Germans wanted to be like the Jews. They wanted to see themselves as the chosen people. And given that, their greatest competition was the Jews. And one of the things that you notice if you read a lot of the Nazis is how a lot of the leading Nazis had enormous, I mean, you have to be somewhat careful when you speak this way, and I'm trying to do it, but they spoke in somewhat awesome or awe-inspired ways about the Jews. The Jews were the people that they saw as their great competitors. And that this is part of Arendt's attempt to understand what she calls this ideological anti-Semitism as opposed to a Jew-hating anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean that they were loving the Jews or Jew-philic, as Eichmann sometimes called himself, but it does mean that there was a way in which their desire to eliminate the Jews came from a kind of respect in some sense. It's a very, I mean, I have to be, I'm trying to be careful in the way I express it, but I think we have to take seriously both the fact that that's her argument and that I think there's a lot of truth to it. So there's a longer question from Christo on the connections and split between Pan-Germanism and Nazism. He says this section from Wikipedia article. Okay, I mean, we can look at it. Hitler and his National Socialist friends shared most of the basic Pan-German visions with the Pan-German League, but nonetheless differences in political style. That's right. The German Workers' Party of Bohemia cut its ties to the Pan-German movement, which was seen as being too dominated by the upper classes, and joined forces with the German Workers' Party by Anton Drexler. I think that's all fair. It's good information. It would be wrong to think that she's saying Hitler was a Pan-German or a member of that movement. He's the follower of it. The point is that his thinking was deeply influenced by it. There's a question from Paul. How is a Pan movement different from simple revanchism? Is the distinction that Panism involves some notion of mystical chosenness? Paul, are you willing to come on? Are you there, Paul? Maybe not. Someone want to? The question is a little unclear to me, and revanchism is I'm wondering how it's being used here. but if someone wants to add to it. In a sense, pan movements differ from the Nazism in a number of ways. The pan movements also differ from a simple kind of conservatism because, as Arendt says, they're based in this tribal, pseudo-mystical tribal consciousness. That's one thing. They have this idea that there is something about being German or Slavic which unites people wherever they are, more so than living in the same state or nation. But also, the PanGermans were people who had a contempt for law and then eventually a contempt for the state. And both of those are related to this idea of a pseudo-mystical sense of the divine chosenness of their movement, of their people, which allows them to govern and rule over lesser peoples and lesser groups. Okay. There we go. There's a question or a comment from Joseph. Roger, can you clarify or elaborate a bit on the passage at the bottom of 237 when Arendt writes, it would be a serious error to assume that the leaders of the pan movements were reactionaries or counter-revolutionaries. As a rule, not too interested in social questions, they never made the mistake of siding with capitalist exploitation, and most of them had belonged, and quite a few continued to belong, to liberal progressive parties. So it's an important point. They were not, a lot of these folks, including von Schorner and others, were progressives and liberals. Their movement had its base in a kind of in a sense that they needed, first of all, in a sense that the state apparatus, the government, was failing and was not providing the kind of representation that it should. So a little bit above that on 237, the paragraph begins, hostility to the state as an institution runs through the theories of all pan movements. And that is something to take very seriously. Halfway down that paragraph, she writes, the PanGermans, who are more articulate politically, always insisted on the priority of national over state interests. And so this is her point. They were progressives in many senses, but what they really were driven by was this sense of a national, pseudo-mystical national interest. They weren't necessarily anti-capitalist or capitalist. Is there more to be said on that, Joseph or someone? The point is that they were, I mean, it's an interesting question to ask why progressives led into this. But what they were was people who wanted to radically remake their society. They wanted to change their society and improve it by elevating a master race or a pseudo-mystically superior race to the center. Okay. On page 243, Ruggi offers a quote on page 243. This is I take it, the bottom of page 243. So in the beginning of the next section on lawlessness, legally government by bureaucracy is government by decree. And this means that power, which in constitutional government only enforces the law, becomes the direct source of all legislation. what is the difference in the two kinds of relationship between law and power? That's a good question. So some of you no doubt know that Arendt wrote a lot about power later in her career. But here, what she's saying is that law is a limited form of government. It's a government that can only do certain things. And that's very frustrating to people who want government to do more. And so let me say this is another connection between progressivism and movements. One of the disturbing elements of progressivism throughout its 120, 130-year history has been a willingness to abandon laws and the rule of law in the name of positive progressive change. Conservatism has always been more associated with the rule of law, law and order, whereas progressivism is often more willing to sort of use administration and bureaucracy to achieve its ends, whether those be environmental ends or civil rights or other things. And here, what she's saying is that the governments of the pan-European parties had agendas, and they wanted to pursue those agendas, and they wanted the power to do so. And if the laws were in the way, they would be willing to overlook them. In addition, as a form of government, the pan movements and progressive movements in general prefer government by decree and government by bureaucracy over government by legislatures and government by lawmakers, because with lawmakers, you have specific people making the law, and because you have specific people making the laws have a source and have a heft to them, and they're not secret. They're there. Whereas decrees can be anonymous, can be secret, and seem to come from out of a spirit. And so if you're a bureaucrat or an administrator applying the law, you can expand it and extend it because it's sort of a secret. Its provenance is secret. Its provenance is somewhat foggy, and you don't have a legislative history, and you don't have a court which is going to tell you that that's against the law. So that's the idea, that there's laws obviously are made by people in power, but the laws are restrictions on the power of political actors and political movements, whereas administrative rule or rule by decree, in a sense, embodies the power of movements. Let me just say we've sort of semi-moved through this first section on tribal movements and tribal nationalism. And one thing we didn't touch on, which is fairly important, I think, is this discussion on page 234, in where Arendt, in a sense, goes on a digression, somewhat of a digression, where she talks about that these tribal nations were based in a rootlessness and a homelessness. These are themes we've heard before. And in this rootlessness, they hit upon this idea of their divine origin and chosenness to give them a sense of meaning and purpose. And then on 234, she says, this divine origin thesis or theory is this is the paragraph at the beginning of 234, is as conspicuous as its political usefulness. The untruth of this theory is as conspicuous as its political usefulness. God created neither men whose origin clearly is procreation, nor peoples according to their natural origin, their different organization and fate in history. So on the one hand, this is just a very snarky but true point, which is God didn't create men as Germans or Americans or Jews or Slavs. And to say that the Jews are the chosen people or the Germans are the chosen people is, on the one hand, simply a politically useful untruth. That when God creates human beings, he creates them all equal in the sense of their rights. They all have equal rights, but they're not equal, obviously, because they're of different sizes and genders and of different strengths and different intelligences, etc. And she says that, and here she makes a very important point that that there are two perversions, a number of perversions, let's put it that way, of this general idea that the way men are equal, the way human beings are equal, is not by nature, but by right. And then this is a point she's going to make again in the next chapter, chapter 9, and it's a point that goes to the heart of a lot of her thinking, but that the way we're equal is through political equality, by guaranteed equal rights. We're not naturally equal. And so she says the desire for creating this idea of divine origin, which makes all Germans equal as above all Jews, is dangerous. But it's related to what she calls positivism and progressivism, right? Which perverted human equality when they set out to demonstrate what cannot be demonstrated, namely that men are equal by nature and different only by history and circumstances, so that they can be equalized not by rights, but by circumstances and education. So for those of you who've read a little Arendt, this is part of her critique of the social and of politics of an attempt to equalize people in the social realm, economically and through status, whereas that's, in her mind, a mistake. Where what politics should do is provide political equality and not seek to do what she says can't be done, which is make everybody equal in society, which for her leads to a kind of conformity and totalitarianism. And then the other perversion of political equality, the other two that she mentions here are nationalism, where we make everyone within a nation equal, and then racism, where we make everyone within a race equal and everyone outside of it unequal. These are all perversions of what she considers to be the only justified idea of equality. Well, there's two. One is the equality of all human beings as human, and then political equality, which is the idea of we all have the rights, same rights. And we'll talk more about that next week when we discuss her idea of the right to have rights, which is the right to have that basic political equality, which for her is the fundamental and really only meaningful human right that humans have. And she develops that in chapter 9 of this book, and we'll talk about that more next week. So if there are questions about it, we can do them now or come back to them next week. There's a comment by Christo about PanSlavism, and he says that it seems to be a fairly living ideology today. That may very well be true, and it's worth thinking about. I think there's a lot of living ideologies today. I don't know enough about the Russian situation. I don't know if Masha's on today, whether the kind of Slavic nationalism that's going on in Russia today is PanSlavism and seeking expansion out, or whether it's more hunkering down within. I think it's one of the questions to be asked about American nationalism. Again, is it related? We've talked about this the last couple of weeks. Is it related to a nationalism that's focused on a landed area, territorial, or is it outward reaching? And if it's going to be a pan movement, it's got to go beyond. It's got to seek this pseudo mystical connection. Ian asks if we might talk a little bit about what she is describing as the pan movement's hostility to the party system. Yeah, I mean, that goes to the next section, the last section. It's, if you watch the video, you'll see that's, to me, one of the most interesting questions. So Masha, Masha, do you want to say something, or should I just read this? She says that PanSlavism. Yeah, go ahead, Masha.
Yes, so I was responding to your question, Roger. It's definitely expansionist and expansive. And one extraordinary thing that you may not know is that when Russia annexed Crimea in March 2014, Putin gave one of his few sort of speeches that are intended to be inspirational and lay out an ideology. And that ideology was the ideology of PanSlavism. And it quoted almost directly from Hitler's Sudetenland speech. It was absolutely extraordinary in that way. I mean, he basically said that they had gone into Crimea because it is Russia's duty to protect other Russian speakers, which is a code word for ethnic Russians in the world, and that supersedes any kind of national borders and national interests.
That's really helpful. I was not. Obviously I'd heard some of that about Crimea, but I had been under a somewhat a mistaken impression that there's this ideologist of his, Dellucci, right? Who I've been told is a state-centered nationalist. So maybe I was thinking about it in those lines, and I may have been misled by that. But it's really
just a quick note. Alexander Dugan is not only an expansionist and a pan-Slavist, but he also draws directly from Nazi ideology. I mean, he's quite open about that, including. I mean, he's a scholar of Nazi mysticism.
Well, that's really helpful, and obviously some of you have read about the connections between Bannon and Dugan and others, so that raises, I think, important questions that we can bring up. Bannon has cited Dugan positively, as far as I've been led to believe, in certain scenarios, and to that extent, it does raise questions about whether some of the Americanist movements, and there's no doubt that what Trump is in some way representing is a kind of Americanist movement, does bear some of this expansionist pseudo mysticism. I think it's too early to tell, is my own view, but to me that's one of the most important questions that I'm looking at very carefully in trying to understand our current political situation in the United States. I'm convinced that Trump is explicitly the head of a movement, and we're going to talk about party and movements in a second based on Ian's question. But the question is that movement pro-totalitarian? Is it expansionist? Is it pseudo-mystical? And these are the kinds of questions that we need to ask ourselves. I think we need to ask ourselves, and which Arendt can help us with. So let me move on to this discussion of state and party that Ian brought up. We're skipping for now part 2 on lawlessness, and let me say I'm happy to come back to it. I know we've talked a bit about bureaucracy. I think it's important just to say that, if you want to pay attention to it, on pages 244 to 245, she distinguishes these two forms of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy as the deformation of the civil services, accompanied by what she calls inefficiency and vexations, and then the other kind of bureaucracy, which is the more rule by decree. She does say that they both have a lot of similarities, and I think that's why we often get confused by them. But Kimberly Braswell had asked in an email, in some ways, isn't the bureaucracy today our protection against Trump and a protection against a movement? That was the question as it came through. And I think the answer is, insofar as the bureaucracy is a kind of machine and a decree-giving manifestation of a movement, no. But insofar as a bureaucracy is an inefficient and vexatious deformation of the civil service, possibly, insofar as it simply makes it harder to get things done. But here's the twist, right? Arendt's argument is that it's the inefficient and vexatious nature of the bureaucracy that leads to the alienation of the people from the state and makes them hostile to the state, which leads them away from parties and to movements. And it's not an accident that one of President Trump's key aims is to dismantle the civil service, because a lot of his supporters, and I should say a lot of people on the left as well, experience government as something they are powerless over, as something they have no control over, and they are hostile to. And so while the civil service as vexatious and inefficient may in some way be able to slow a movement down in our country, and we could see it, and people are celebrating the civil service, that they might do a work slowdown or things like that. We have to be careful, because the more you do that, the more you alienate people from government, and the more the more power and fuel you will give to the movements. So with that said, let's turn to section 3 of the text on party and movements. This is the centerpiece of the chapter, and it's one that I find really powerful to teach when I teach this book in the United States, because so many of my students are predisposed against the two-party system. They think that the two-party system is not democratic. It takes away their voice. They say things like the two parties are the same. They say that they always move to the center. There's no radicalism. And there's a real desire by a lot of people in this country, on the left and the right, for a multi-party system like they have in much of continental Europe and around the world. And as sort of a side point to her discussion of party and movements, Arendt is here making the case that one of the main reasons that the UK and the United States were inoculated from the rise of authoritarianism and totalitarianism was their two-party structure, right? So the argument here, and she says it in many places, but on page 250, right at the beginning, she says the nation state system's ruin, having been prepared by its own overseas imperialism, was eventually carried out by those movements which had originated outside its own realm, outside the realm of the state. And when it came to pass that movements began successfully to compete with the nation state's party system, it was also seen that they could undermine only countries with a multi-party system, and that the mere imperialist tradition was not sufficient to give them mass appeal, right? So Great Britain had an imperialist system, clearly the largest one, and it had economic dislocation, and it had anger, but it didn't turn into an authoritarian system, she says. And her answer, she asks why, and she says is that in a two-party system, both parties think they can eventually control the state. And since they both believe they can control the state, they don't hate the state. They fetishize the state. They want it. And they want to control the state. Whereas in a multi-party system, and so the citizens feel in a two-party system as with an identity with the state. They sometimes hate it when they're not in power, but they want it. Whereas in a multi-party system, the aim of the party is not to control the state. It's to be as powerful as you can and then create coalitions. And you don't actually ever control the state in a multi-party system. You control a certain element, parties, certain ministers, certain if you have what they call them, you have the Department of Interior, you have the Foreign Affairs, but you don't have the whole state. And so what the two-party system does is create a system in which the people identify still with the state, and that for her is absolutely essential. So we can turn on to page 254 and look at a couple of these lines, which I think are worth paying attention to. So in the middle of the page, the trouble with the Continental parties, separated on principle from government and power. So let's just take that apart. Separated on principle from government and power, because the parties don't seek to take over government. They seek to have a certain percentage of the seats and then make deals. And they always appeal not to, they don't try and take 51%. They try and take 30% or 40. I mean, in a continental party system, if you get 35% of the vote, that's really good. So you're not appealing to the whole. You're not identifying with a majority of people. You're always identifying with a minority of the people. And that to her is an important difference. So that these continental parties, principally separated from government and power, was not so much that they were trapped in the narrative of particular interests, is that they were ashamed of these interests and therefore developed those justifications which led each one into an ideology claiming that its particular interests coincided with the most general interests of humanity. So since we're only a minority and yet we want to govern, we have to have an ideology that justifies a minority governing a majority, right? How is it that a minority of the Greens or the Social Democrats or the Liberals or the Socialists can govern the whole? And we have to believe that what we're governing is what we're representing is an ideologically true and justified claim. So she says the Conservative Party was not content to defend the interests of landed property, but needed a philosophy according to which God had created man to till the soil by the sweat of his brow. And the same for the liberal progressive ideology of the middle class parties that claim that the proletariat is the leader of mankind. So it's a strange combination, she says, of lofty philosophy and down-to-earth interests. We're sort of brass-tack interest, but because we're a minority, we need a philosophy, a lofty philosophy, to justify it. And then in the last sentence of the page, in other words, the chief difference between the Anglo-Saxon and the Continental Party is that the Anglo-Saxon Party is a political organization of citizens who need to act in concert in order to act at all. You need a bunch of citizens who may disagree about a lot of things, right? You're not just the Greens or just the Liberals or just the Conservatives, but citizens who need to act together amidst our differences and form a majority. Whereas the continental parties are organizations of private individuals who want their interests to be protected and thus organize a party-based interest politics. That's the difference. And what she's saying is that on the continent, these movements emerged at a time when the contempt for Parliament was enormous. And that was throughout Europe. By the way, it was also in the United States at that time. I mean, the United States this was a time when the Congress and government was very unpopular. I think obviously we all know we're seeing that now. And it's a dangerous situation because in such a time when people feel that the state, the parties, the current parties offer them nothing because they don't feel like, even if they attain power, even if the Democrats attain power, I mean, look what happened in the last 8 years of Obama's administration, President Obama. The Democrats were in power for 8 years, and so many Democrats felt like we didn't get what we want, right? And under, the Republicans felt they didn't get what they want. There's a sense that the government, the system is not working. We talk about, gridlock or deadlock or whatever you want to call it, and partisanship. For whatever reason, people are feeling that the government is not giving them what they want. And even in a two-party system like in the United States, there's a sense that we are alienated from government. And so on page 256, she writes, "The alienation of the masses from government, which was the beginning of their eventual hatred and disgust with Parliament, was different in France and other Western countries than in Germany and the Central European countries." And the reason, she says, is that in Germany, the state was above the parties. Even if you controlled the parties and you were head of the government, you didn't have control of the state. You couldn't do much. And it was this sense of inefficiency, vexatiousness, and also lack of control that led to the masses coming to hate the parties and the government, and led them to embrace movements which saw themselves not as parties, not as simply interest groups, but as parties above the parties, as she says, and as they called themselves, that would seek to take over and break through the deadlock and break through the laws and the deformities of the bureaucracy and the other institutions which were preventing the people from feeling that the government was representing them. And these movements became a radicalized way to say the parties and the government and the Congress are not answering to us. And so we want a movement that will take over and break through these niceties, these institutional supports, and listen. And this is what she thinks these movements are, which is why they're so counter to law and counter to and bureaucratic in the sense of seeking a machine that will do the bidding of the movement. All right, that's a long, maybe too long. I'm sorry, but these are important parts of the text. Are there any thoughts or questions or comments before I can do a little more on it, but thought I'd stop here for a second to breathe. So let me say, if things come up, please feel free. She makes a distinction between fascism and totalitarianism on page 256 to 257, or actually 256 to 260, really. That's, I think, worth paying attention to because, we use these words somewhat interchangeably, and even if it may be the case that totalitarianism is not emerging today. That doesn't mean that other kinds of authoritarian governments and potentially fascist governments might not around the world. And so on page 256 to 257, she makes this distinction that for the Italians and for the Italian fascists, she says each group, let's just look at it. Since the end of the last century, the repute of these constitutional parliaments and parties had been declining. Right, we lost our sense of respect for parliaments. And for this reason alone, each group that claimed to represent something above party and class interests and started outside of parliament had a great chance for popularity. And I think this is clearly the case around the world today. Movements that start outside of parliament, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or the Bernie Sanders movement or Donald Trump's movement or the Tea Party or these new movements in Europe, are all have a great chance for popularity because they are seen as divorced from the state and normal parties. They seem more competent, more sincere, more concerned with public affairs. But here she writes, this, however, was so in appearance only, for the true goal of every party above parties was to promote one particular interest until it had devoured all others, and to make one particular group the master of the state machine. So the Nazis wanted to make the Aryans, and they would take one issue and say, we're going to deal with that, boom, and then they would pick another issue, and the movement never ends. And insofar as a movement is a movement, it can never stop. But what distinguished fascism from Nazism was that fascism really stopped. It didn't keep the movement going once it ended up in power. So she writes, this is what finally happened in Italy under Mussolini's fascism, which up to 1938 was not totalitarian, but just an ordinary nationalist dictatorship, developed logically from a multi-party democracy. For there is indeed some truth in the old truism about the affinity between majority rule and dictatorship, and this affinity has nothing whatever to do with totalitarianism. It is obvious that after many decades of inefficient and muddled multi-party rule, the seizure of the state for the advantage of one party can come as a great relief, because it assures at least, though only for a limited time, some consistency, some permanence, and a little less contradiction. I think this is an enormously powerful and important question that we should all be asking ourselves right now. Would a little fascism come as an enormous relief to us? I mean, I don't think Arendt mitigates fascism, but you can tell me if you think she does. But what she's saying is multi-party democratic systems break down and become inefficient and vexatious and become hated. And I don't think her preferred solution is fascism. So let me just be clear. But she understands that throughout history, democracies have often, almost religiously, turned into authoritarianism at some point. I mean, this is just true throughout history. And there's a reason for it, she says. If it's done by a group that simply wants to rule well and try and make it more efficient and more consistent with some permanence, which is what, by the way, the Romans called a dictator. I mean, we should remember that the word dictator was developed by the Romans as a person appointed in times of crisis to rule in a way with an efficiency that democracy, or not democracy, because Rome wasn't a democracy, but the Roman constitutional state could not, for a limited amount of time. And that was the key, a limited amount of time. And, Clinton Rossiter, some of you may remember Clinton Rossiter, wrote a very famous and important book called Constitutional Dictatorship, in which he argues that no constitutional democratic state can exist without periods of dictatorship, and that the key was having a constitutional provision for a limited dictatorship like the Romans did. And he argues that the failure of the United States was that they didn't explicitly put one in, but he argues that over time, the United States has developed a constitutional tradition that allows for it. And his main arguments are Lincoln and Roosevelt. Two very famous and important presidents. And he argues that both assumed dictatorial powers that were accepted by and recognized by the Congress for limited amounts of time in order to deal with crises. And so Rossiter's book and argument, right, is somewhat similar to, I think, somewhat of what Arendt is saying here. The problem, one question that I think is worth asking is some authoritarianism for a short period of time within a constitutional limits an acceptable part of a constitutional democratic regime? I think it's a very important question, and I'm not suggesting it is. I'm not saying Arendt says it is, but I think to read this and not think that that's a question is at least to read a little too hastily. There's the problem, if you continue reading, is right that the Nazis went further, and they didn't stop with simply controlling the state, and they wanted to control every part of the state. And not only that, what the Nazis really aimed at, she says, was destroying the state. So if you read the next paragraph, 2 paragraphs below, even though totalitarian movements and their predecessors, the Pan movements, were not parties above parties, aspiring to seize the state machine, but movements aiming at the destruction of the state, the Nazis found it very convenient to pose as such, that is, to pretend to follow the faithfully Italian model of fascism. So the Nazis posed as fascists who wanted to control the state, but what they really wanted was to destroy the state. And that's where their real danger lay. And we'll talk about that at length in chapter 12 on totalitarianism and power, how the Nazis in power sought to destroy the state, not take it over. Are there, I've said some pretty provocative things. I don't know if people have thoughts or comments on them. Happy to hear. Maybe it wasn't provocative enough. Howard, are you trying to talk? I can't tell. Your mic's not on.
Well, this is Gary Patton. It struck me that your remarks are incredibly on point with respect to contemporary activities right now in the United States of America. And yesterday, these 2 cohorts of Trump speaking before the extreme right-wing group that has backed Mr. Trump, called, Bannon particularly, for the deconstruction of the administrative state. And I think this is exactly what you're raising as Arendt trying to grapple with what is the significance of that in various contexts. And it seems to me that we don't know what's going on yet, which I think you said. Is this a move towards a genuine totalitarianism,
or is it essentially an effort to gain control over the state and make it function as people want it to? And frankly, I felt they were very effective in their presentation yesterday, appealing to Trump's base, certainly, but also to ordinary Americans who say, yes, that's true. This damn thing isn't working. And Trump is, for God's sakes, following through on his promises for once. The politicians never do that. We probably did the right thing. So what is the outcome going to be? I think the wheel's still in spin here, but the issues that you're talking about, I just think are on target completely with today's reality, probably in other countries, but certainly in our own.
Can you hear me, Roger?
Yes.
Okay, I finally solved all my computer problems. I'm not very good at that. It seems to me we've left out an important element, that being economics. Both in the early part of the 20th century, there were extreme economic pressures that impacted the political scene. And since the 1970s, at least in the Western world, if not throughout the world, we've had the rise of neoliberalism and the United States attempt to promote the Washington consensus throughout the world. I think those issues are important to integrate with some of the questions that you've been asking.
Thanks both Gary and Howard. So I think, let me just say, I didn't see, I haven't heard or seen or read the speeches yesterday, but I think with Gary, the way you characterized it, from what I understand of Bannon and Trump, is right. I think that there is a lot of people. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in the last 2 weeks who say things like, well, he's right about, the regulation or the bureaucracy or whatever, but this and that. And I think one of the problems is a lot of people don't trust him to be doing this. But that's a separate question. I mean, it's not a completely separate question from the fact that I think Gary's right, that there's a lot of people who feel like we need somebody to break through this inefficient and vexatious, decrepit civil service. I would simply add that the way that's supposed to happen, and this is my return to Ted Lowy, who I was trying to memorialize earlier, the way that's supposed to happen is through Congress, right? Congress is supposed to take the action of legislating and representing the two parties and not the president. And to the extent in our country the president is the one who does it, it becomes a government by decree and a government by bureaucracy, which is deeply dangerous. And so this is my shout out to Congress, that what we really need is for them to do their jobs. What Howard is saying about the economics, again, I think there's no doubt that economics is a part of this. What he calls neoliberalism, which is a word I find hard to pin down, but if we put it in the sense of free market, unregulated capitalism, where each individual becomes their own corporation and has to brand themselves and look out for themselves, as opposed to being part of a community where they are taken care of by a class or a family or a state or a world. There's no doubt that has happened and has created an incredible sense of insecurity and loneliness and homelessness in the Arendtian sense that we've been talking about. I want
to interrupt because it's also part of the lack of faith in the legislative process, because we're constantly told that it's transnational big companies and big money that, and that's the people's interest that the Congress is responding to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, when we talk about the hatred of government right now, I mean, part of it's bureaucratic, and I've said that a couple times. So let me say, another part of it is corruption. This sense that these congressmen spend all of their time begging for money, going into these little rooms down the hall because they're not allowed to call from their offices, and spending all their time dialing the same, you know, 2% of the population that gives money and talking to them. And clearly, this kind of corruption is a huge reason people are upset, both on the left and the right. I mean, we should remember that both President Trump and Senator Sanders, built their campaigns around the sense that they were not taking money from PACs and wealthier individuals. Obviously, that didn't pan out at the end, but that was at least how it started. There's a question from Jenny Lynn that on page 227, tribal nationalism insists that its own people is surrounded by a world of enemies. Yeah, not one against all. It claims its people to be unique, individual, incompatible with all others, and denies theoretically the very possibility of a common mankind. Yeah, I think that's exactly. I mean, that's actually one of my favorite quotes. It's this sense that we imagine ourselves as a pseudo mystical entity above and different from, and that takes away the possibility of the only real natural equality that Arendt recognizes, which is an equality of that we're all human beings, which she thinks doesn't make us equal, but is the natural equality she recognized. Scott Goldstein asks, culturally, we've seen something similar. We used to have 3 major network sources and PBS. Now that entertainment has been fractured, the messages that the media use to cultivate and the sense of shared cultural touchstones is gone. So in a sense, we have fractured like a multi-party systems as our point of views have diverged along with a narrow casting. Trump and Bannon are capitalizing on this. I think this is extraordinarily interesting and important. Let me give a shout out to a man named Martin Gurri, Gurri, who has a book that I think is sort of essential to understand some of this stuff called The Revolt of the Public. This will be a plug for our fall conference at Bard in October 12th and 13th, because it's on crises of democracy. And in addition to Masha Gessen, who has been helpful and joining us here, Martin Gurri is going to be speaking at that conference. And Gurri's book looks at the rise of the internet and technology and argues that every authoritative narrative, whether it's the New York Times as the paper of record, or the Republican Party as one side, or the Democratic Party, or the U.S. government, or any authoritative centralizing source, always tells a story that's partial and leaves a lot out. And inevitably, because we're human, we'll make mistakes. But most people at most times, or at all times, people couldn't check those stories. And if they did get checked, the people who checked them would not have the access to present alternative views right away and in a way accessible to all. And with the explosion of information and the ability to point out the inconsistencies, point out the corruptions, point out the mistakes, it's simply now a fact that every single story of any interest offered by the mainstream media is going to immediately be checked, attacked, and there's going to be alternatives offered to it. And those alternatives are accessible to everyone. And everyone will be able to sort of go and pick who's offering the alternatives that I find most convincing. And Guri goes through this in his book in a very intelligent and helpful way, and basically raises the question of whether any kind of authoritative narrative, governmental, press, business, etc., is even possible in the modern era and in the information era. And I think, well, he says the likelihood is no, and I think he's probably right. That could be very depressing. It could also be very liberating. But I think what it does is it forces us to think about what kind of politics could exist in such a world without authoritative sources. And my guess is it's going to have to be a much more federalized, localized, decentralized kind of politics to some degree. I could be wrong, but that's one thought that comes out of Arendt that I see. Masha answers, it seems to me that there might be a useful distinction between dissatisfaction with the performance of government, right, the demands for good government, and contempt for the state. Okay. I think that a common interpretation of Trump's drain the swamp rhetoric as an expression of dissatisfaction is too charitable and misleading. It's in fact an expression of contempt for the state as currently constituted. We have talked about Arendt's stress on contempt a couple of times now, rightly so. It's a key fixture of his political persona. So absolutely, it's a key fixture of his persona. He has contempt for the state. The question is, you want to say that that's distinct from dissatisfaction with the performance of government. Okay, that's the $64 million question. Is Trump someone who wants to destroy the state and replace it with a movement because he wants totalitarianism? Or is he someone who is, as Masha says, dissatisfied with the performance of the state and of government and wants to take it over, break it apart, maybe make it smaller, make it work better, and then go his merry way? Masha, I take it from your question that you think we have good reason to believe that it's the former, that he wants to destroy the state and not reconstitute it. I think that's an important point. I'm not going to say it's wrong. I'm not 100% sure I know that. I'm certainly worried about it. But I would say that, to me at least, the evidence suggests, at least some of the evidence, a lot of the evidence suggests otherwise, that his contempt for the state is a extreme rhetorical exaggeration of a dissatisfaction with government. But maybe I fully admit that I'm open to being too optimistic here. I'm an optimist by nature. Do you want to tell me I'm being too optimistic, Masha?
Oh, I don't claim to know. I did want to point out the distinction because I think that in a lot of the conversations about Trump and his cabinet appointments and just the general sort of cacophony that we've been confronted with over the last month, that distinction has been lost, and especially sort of on the side of political liberals, it's all of his cabinet appointments are politically horrifying, right? But I think they actually fall into different categories. He began with appointing people to head each agency, a person who was actually fundamentally opposed to the mission of that agency. He has since made several appointments that are much more sort of in the normal political realm of just extreme conservatism in American politics, which is a completely different animal. And I think that looking at drawing that distinction is just useful in trying to understand what's going on.
Let me just add to that, you know, the one thing I will say has given me hope about his political appointments so far, and this is a funny thing maybe to say, is the number of people he's appointed from the army. Now, why does that give me hope? I mean, and I'd say two things. One is the army has become the most egalitarian and is also the most rule-bound institution in American life today. And so from simply a cultural point of view, there's a lot about it that is intolerant of discrimination and racism of the kind that would be necessary for a kind of racist totalitarian movement. The second part is that if you look at page 258 to 259, where again she's talking about fascism versus totalitarianism, she says that the Italian fascist party was defined by the fact against the Nazis that they didn't replace any of the army. And in fact, she says in the middle of the page, the difference between the fascist and the totalitarian movements is best illustrated by their attitude towards the army, that is, toward the national institution par excellence. In contrast to the Nazis and the Bolsheviks, who destroyed the spirit of the army by subordinating it to the political commissars or totalitarian elite formations, the fascists could use such intensely national instruments as the army, with which they identified themselves as they had identified themselves with the state. They wanted a fascist state and a fascist army, but still an army and a state. Only in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, army and state became subordinated functions of the movement. So one of the questions that I think the clear respect that Trump has for the army raises is he showing respect for the army and the state, or is he seeking to co-opt them politically? I know nothing about the people he's appointed except what I hear from others, right? I know very little about this world. But what I hear is that these are some of the most respected, yes, they're conservative, but they're some of the most respected people of integrity in the armed forces. That's what we hear. We could be told, I have no idea to know if it's true. But if it's true, it suggests to me that there's not an attack on the state going on. It's one of the things that gives me the most confidence that Gary's point, that what Trump and Bannon are doing is trying to, in a sense, dismantle an administrative state gone awry rather than destroy it. And obviously, we all will wait and see. The beauty of reading Arendt is not that she offers the answers, it's that she helps us ask these questions. And I think these are the questions we need to be asking.
Roger, this is Gary Patton again. Let me just follow up because I do think that we don't know yet the answer, but I want to suggest, and actually I think your comments through these seminar sessions have gone in this direction. I think as citizens who don't want Trump to become the advent of totalitarianism, it behooves us to treat the entire process as though it were simply an effort to make the state perform as the majority wants it to, which is what he claims, of course, and not to just jump to he is the new Hitler, he is the new totalitarian, we must have a coup, which some on the left are calling for, where they're actually asking for the quote unquote deep state to take over because he is such an obnoxious person. That is incredibly dangerous, and we need to be going in our ones and in our hundreds and in our thousands to the Congress members who represent us where we live and demand that they fix the state, fix our administrative apparatus, and in some cases they may be able to work with Trump to do so, but that is their job, and not cede to the idea that, well, we've had a totalitarian takeover, because simply by ceding that, we make it much more likely, if not inevitable.
I mean, Gary, I agree with everything you said. I will add just one caveat, right? Which is we also have to proceed with open eyes and wariness. There's no doubt in my mind that we're dealing with a movement, and it's a movement that could turn in different directions. I don't think it's fated to go in one direction or the other. There's also no doubt in my mind, and this has very little to do with much except the fact that he has he's a troublesome character. I mean, I don't want to say anything that, is probably not known to much of you. As you watch his press conferences and read his tweets as much as I do. And, I think we have to be aware that this is a dangerous period of our history. We don't have we aren't Rome. We don't have a constitutional dictatorship in our constitution. He hasn't been appointed for a limited amount of time. We need to be aware. So I actually fundamentally agree with you, Gary. I mean, today the Times ran a piece about how the Democrats are being forced not to work with Trump by their base. I think it's a huge mistake. That's my own view. I take it you share it. But that's a political view. People can have different opinions. That doesn't come from Hannah Arendt, right? I do worry that the more we set up roadblocks to getting done something, the more the movement will grow stronger. That said, there's no doubt that it's one thing to make government work. It's another thing to make it work in a very conservative way, which is what he and his many of his supporters would like. I mean, I think he is probably more liberal than most of them. So I think, that doesn't mean you should just give him a blank check. I don't, that's not my approach to politics. And I don't think it's yours. I mean, so, I'm wary. I think you need to be careful, but I share your view that what I've tried to say in what I've written, and some of you read what I write and what I've said in these, is that we have to look at what he does. And yes, what he says is sometimes important, and what he says can be sometimes horrifying. But what he does, and so far, he hasn't broken any laws. I mean, the one law that we could say he might have broken is the emolument clause of the Constitution. That's a complicated one, and he probably should give up his business. I mean, I think that's clear. But in general, he hasn't broken laws. He's actually, if you look at, he just appointed a Supreme Court justice who's a critic of executive power. He's, for all the criticism that he's going to get about what he just did with transgender bathrooms, it's a giving up of national executive power, as is his positions on many other states' right issues. So, in a lot of ways, if you look at what he's doing, it's not an overly authoritarian approach to governing. If you look at the way he acts, it's quite authoritarian. And that's, I think, one of the contradictions that we're all going to have to, I don't want to say get used to, but live with in a very uncomfortable way over the next, we'll see how many years.
I want to just say I completely share your concern and wariness, Roger.
Yeah.
Don't
I know
ever.
you do.
I know. I mean, it just. And I appreciate these More Monday newsletter things you put out, which are not specifically on a deconstruction of Hannah Arendt, but are in effect reflections on our current situation. If people aren't reading them, they ought to. They're fantastic.
Thank you. Elizabeth writes, I'm behind in the reading. Question about dictatorship and democracy. Is there a way to limit it while in power to avoid a takeover a la Erdogan in Turkey? Well, look, the answer is mobilize, right? That's how you, You prevent it by having a strong other institutions. And as people have said over and over again over the last couple of weeks, the way you keep institutions strong is you support them, support the press, support the Congress, support people who stand up to things that look authoritarian.
Could I
yes,
jump in?
Okay, we're almost out of time. Let me just look. Yesterday, Bannon announced that many cabinet nominations, as we already suspected, are there specifically to disassemble. Yeah, I think that's right, Scott. I think there's a lot of attempt to disassemble. The question is, what's the goal? Is the goal to disassemble and destroy institutions and not reassemble? Or is the goal to disassemble what's thought to be dysfunctional institutions in a way that they can be either reassembled or reconstituted in ways that are more effective? Dina asked, isn't it possible that Trump doesn't care about the difference between contempt and inefficiencies? Yes, of course. And we will have to pay attention. Why not take Bannon at his word? He said, isn't just destroy the state. I think that's a good question. We should definitely take people at their words. But is he saying destroy the state, or is he saying destroy the dysfunctional state? And I think he means the latter. We'll see. My biggest fear is a Trumpian Gleichschaltung, which is an equal leveling, Bob says, that will keep replacing agency people and replace them with sycophants. Look, that's something we should all be worried about. Hey, Bob got that 100% right. What I like about some of these military folks is that they don't seem like sycophants. I could be wrong. And I think that's what we have to look at. But some of these people are people who are known for disagreeing with their superiors. I mean, we know that General Mattis has a number of times disagreed with Trump about torture and about other things. And it's important. One of the things that I've actually been impressed about by Trump is that he doesn't appoint sycophants. And so obviously if they turn out to be sycophants, we're in trouble. But I've been impressed by the fact that at least my reading is he hasn't. Harold, you want to ask your question now?
I just wanted to make a comment. I think it's important for people to remember that while the population looks at Trump as a corporate leader, he's not a corporate leader. He's never had a corporation with a board of trustees. He's never had to work with a corporate structure. He's an LLC, thousands of them, I guess, but he actually controls everything. He's never had to compromise with anyone within his organization. And the way I see him running this presidency is basically a bunch of loyalists, which were his family and his business, and now he's extended his family and running it like he ran his business, as opposed to, if someone who was the president of General Motors and would know how to operate in a different way. I just think it's important to know that that's the difference between him and other people in the corporate world.
Well said. And also Masha's last comment here that, look, his actions matter. I mean, I said before, there's a difference, I think, between the authoritarianism of his actions and the non-authoritarianism of many of his policies. But his actions matter. And I think anyone who doesn't understand that and the rhetorical value of it is mistaken. So I think I 100% agree. To me, the greatest danger we see in Trump so far is the just decimation of norms of civility and of appropriate behavior, but also of just kindness and not calling things what they are. I mean, anti-Semitic acts, racist acts, anti-Islamic acts, these things need to be called out, not in political correct terms. And we do need to, he's got a brand where he doesn't become politically correct, and I understand that. But he's got to be able to come out and say this is not acceptable more than he has, and not wait till people beg for it for weeks, like it happened with the anti-Semitic acts that have been happening, and his speech about it this week. We're over time. This was a great conversation. As you see, the book is getting closer and closer to where we want it to go, right? We're almost in the totalitarianism section. Chapter 9 is one of the most famous chapters of the book. It's about human rights and about the rights of man. So I bet we're going to have a very interesting conversation about that next week. I look forward to talking to you all about it. We're going to leave the mics on, and people who want to continue the conversation for a little bit can do so. But thank you all very much. I hope you enjoy continuing to read Hannah Arendt.